Welcome to Stories Cafe, where I'm your host for today's gripping mystery. We're diving into the snowy peaks of the Swiss Alps, joining Poirot and Captain Hastings at a luxurious sanatorium turned deadly trap. Before we start, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Put it in the comments below. If you enjoyed the tale, please give it a like. Your support keeps this cafe buzzing. Now, grab a steaming mug of hot chocolate and let's unravel this chilling Alpine mystery together. Chapter 1. The Sanctuary in the Snow. The affair at Lac Noir began with the vision of leisurely winter days in Switzerland. I had pictured Captain Hastings and myself strolling through St. Moritz's chic promenades, warmed by Swiss cuisine in the glow of a cozy hotel lounge after a dreary London winter. But fate, as it so often does with Hercule Poirot, had other plans. A telegram arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in late January, just as we finalized our travel itinerary. Poirot's gray eyes scanned the yellow slip with that sharp focus reserved for matters of true intrigue, his coffee cup settling with a soft clink on its saucer. "Hastings," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mustache. "Our holiday must undergo a slight adjustment." "Trouble, Kay?" I asked, sensing the weight behind his calm demeanor. "A consultation, mon ami." "A delicate matter," Kay handed me the telegram, its words terse yet urgent. Dr. Emile of the Clinique Lac Noir requested Poirot's expertise for a discreet and pressing issue. The clinic, nestled high in the Alps above Lake Geneva, was some 40 kilometers from our intended destination. "This Dr. Kawai," ventured, "an old friend. We met years ago in Brussels, before the war," Poirot replied, his fingers tapping the table thoughtfully. "A brilliant physician, specializing in nervous disorders, particularly shell-shock veterans. For him to summon Hercule Poirot, it is no trivial matter." 3 days later, we were climbing treacherous mountain roads in a hired motor car, our driver deftly navigating hairpin turns as the weather grew menacing. The 2-hour ascent from the railway station revealed a landscape of raw, breathtaking, beauty-jagged peaks piercing the sky, snow-dusted pines clinging to cliffs. "Mon Dieu, it is magnificent," Poirot exclaimed, his breath fogging the window, though his grip on the door handle tightened with each dizzying bend. The Clinique Lac Noir appeared like a modernist mirage, sleek lines of pale stone and steel blending into the mountainside. Below, a steep, snow-laden slope dropped to the frozen, obsidian surface of the lake that named the Place of Black Mirror, reflecting the brooding clouds above. "Impressive," I remarked as we pulled into the circular drive. "Like a castle in the sky, eh?" Poirot nodded, but his eyes were already dissecting the scene, cataloging every detail with that relentless precision that had cracked countless cases. "Observe, Hastings, the geometry, every angle deliberate, every line a marriage of form and function. It speaks of a mind obsessed with order." The entrance hall echoed this austere elegance, polished marble floors, stark white walls adorned with sparse modern art, and an air of clinical calm. Dr. Emile greeted us moments after our arrival, a tall, lean man of about 55, with prematurely white hair swept back from a high forehead. His dark eyes burned with intensity, and his aristocratic bearing hinted at old European refinement. "Monsieur Poirot," he exclaimed, clasping Poirot's hands. "Kay, and Captain Hastings, a pleasure. Thank you for coming on such short notice." His warmth was genuine, yet a nervous edge lingered, a fleeting glance toward the windows, a hushed tone even in greeting. His hands, steady as a surgeon's, betrayed no tremor, but his manner suggested a man under strain. "You'll find your quarters most comfortable," Dr. Coe continued, guiding us toward a sleek reception area. The clinic thrives on absolute rest. No newspapers, no telephones, no outside distractions. My patients find it ideal for recovery. A nurse, Alina, appeared at his side, her crisp uniform and pinned-back dark hair exuding quiet competence. She moved with the ease of someone attuned to her employer's every need. "Alina will show you to your rooms," Dr. Coe said. "We dine at 7 early, perhaps by London standards, but the mountain air sharpens the appetite." As we followed Alina through the corridors, the first signs of a storm stirred outside. The wind howled, rattling the vast windows, where thick snowflakes began to fall, heavy with the promise of a blizzard. Poirot paused at a window, his reflection ghostly in the darkening glass. "Voyons," he murmured, almost to himself. "We have arrived at a most opportune moment." His words hung unfinished, but their weight sent a shiver through me. In the distance, a low rumble rolled through the peaks. Not thunder, not at this season or altitude. It swelled briefly, then faded, leaving only the wail of the wind and the soft tap of snow against the glass. The mountains, it seemed, were sealing us in. Chapter 2. Death in Crystal Waters. Chapter 2. Death in Crystal Waters. I was awakened not by the gentle chime of the bedside clock, but by a peculiar quality of silence that seemed to press against the windows of our guest room. The storm that had been gathering strength throughout the previous evening had spent itself during the night, leaving behind an eerie stillness that was almost tangible. Poirot was already up and dressed, standing at the window with that characteristic posture of intense concentration. His small, neat figure was silhouetted against the pale morning light, and I could see his breath forming small clouds in the chilled air of the room. "Bon Mata Hastings," he said, without turning. "Come and observe, if you please, the handiwork of Mother Nature." I joined him at the window and immediately understood the cause of his fascination. During the night, an enormous avalanche had swept down from the peaks above, effectively sealing the single mountain road that connected the clinic to the outside world. Where yesterday there had been a narrow but passable route winding down through the pine forests, now there lay a vast field of snow and debris, with the occasional dark trunk of an uprooted pine protruding like the mast of a sunken ship. "Good Lord," I exclaimed. "We're completely cut off, aren't we?" Christie, Poirot pled, his gray eyes studying the scene with that methodical intensity it knew so well. Most convenient for someone who wishes to ensure that certain events remain undisturbed by outside interference. Before I could inquire what he meant by this rather cryptic observation, a sharp cry echoed through the corridors of the clinic, a sound that cut through the morning silence like a blade. It was followed immediately by the rapid patter of footsteps and the urgent murmur of voices. We dressed hastily and made our way toward the source of the disturbance. The hydrotherapy wing of the clinic was located on the ground floor, accessible through a series of connecting corridors that maintained the building's theme of geometric precision. As we approached, we encountered Alina, the nurse we had met the previous evening, hurrying in the opposite direction. Her usually composed features were pale with shock, and she clutched a set of keys in her trembling hand. "There has been an accident," she said breathlessly, her slight accent more pronounced in her distress. "Dr. Coy, Hayes, in the pool. I must telephone for assistance." She gestured helplessly word the windows beyond which the avalanche had made such communication impossible. The hydrotherapy pool was housed in what could only be described as a cathedral of glass and steel. The rooms soared to a height of perhaps 30 feet, its walls consisting almost entirely of windows that provided a spectacular view of the frozen lake below and the snow-capped peaks beyond. Under normal circumstances, I imagine the effect would have been both inspiring and therapeutic. This morning, however, the chamber had been transformed into something altogether more sinister. The pool itself was a marvel of modern engineering, rectangular in shape, approximately 40 feet in length and 20 in width, with what appeared to be an elaborate system of pipes and machinery visible beneath the decorative stonework that surrounded it. Most remarkable of all, however, was the thin sheet of ice that had formed across its surface during the night, creating what appeared to be a crystal window into the depths below. And it was through this natural glass that we could see the figure of Dr. Emil Cole floating face down in the center of the pool, his white hair streaming like kelp in the gently circulating water. Monsieur Poirot breathed, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Most extraordinary, the local constable, a sturdy mountain man named Klaus Weber, who had been trapped at the clinic by the same avalanche that imprisoned the rest of us, was standing helplessly at the pool's edge. His weathered face bore the expression of a man confronted with matters far beyond his usual purview of minor local infractions. "I cannot break the ice without disturbing everything," he explained in heavily accented English as we approached. "The machinery. I do not understand how it operates." Poole nodded thoughtfully, then began a systematic examination of the pool's perimeter. I watched as he studied the elaborate system of controls that governed the water temperature, circulation, and chemical treatment. His attention was particularly drawn to what appeared to be a protective grate that covered the pool. A safety feature, no doubt, designed to prevent accidents of precisely this nature. "Most curious," he murmured, crouching beside the mechanism that controlled the grate. "Guard, Hastings, this grating, it has been refined with considerable care." I bent to examine the apparatus more closely. The grate itself was made of stainless steel with a mesh fine enough to support a person's weight while allowing water to circulate free. It was secured by a series of bolts that showed clear evidence of recent manipulation. It appears someone removed this safety barrier and then replaced it, I observed. But surely Dr. Cole would not have entered the pool with the grate in place. That would make escape impossible. "Exactly," Poirot said softly. "Most illuminating, is it not? Dr. Heinrich Zimmer, whom we had been introduced to briefly the previous evening, appeared at this moment with a set of keys that would allow access to the pool's control systems. He was a young man of perhaps 35, with earnest manner of one, dedicated to his profession, though I noticed his hands shook slightly as he manipulated controls. The heating system has continued to operate throughout the night," he explained, as the ice began to crack and dissolve under the influence of the warming water. The pool maintains a constant temperature of 28 C for therapeutic harpos. The ice formation is only superficial, a result of the extra cold that penetrated even our heating systems. As the ice dissolved, the tragic reality of Dr. C's fate became undeniably clear. The distinguished physician floated motionless in the center of the pool, his evening clothes sodden and his face bearing an expression of almost peaceful repose that seemed strangely at odds with the circumstances of his death. "We must recover the body," Constable Weber declared, though his reluctance to disturb what was clearly a crime scene was evident in his manner. Poirot interjected sharply. "First, we observe, we record, we understand what the scene wishes to tell us." For the next quarter hour, our friend conducted what could only be described as a masterclass in criminal investigation. He examined every aspect of the pool area with that meticulous attention to detail that had solved so many seemingly possible cases. He studied the positioning of Dr. C's body, the condition of his clothing, the precise mechanism by which the safety grate had been secured, T, and the various control systems that governed the pool's operation. Meanwhile, word of the tragedy had spread throughout the clinic, and we soon found ourselves surrounded by the other inhabitants of this remote sanctuary. Major Reginald Thornfield appeared, his military bearing evident despite the tremor in his hands that spoke of his nervous condition. The Dea Countess Vladislava Korzakov arrived in the company of Alina, her aristocratic features composed but watchful. Dr. Margaret Vance, the visiting neurologist, observed the proceedings with the clinical detachment of one accustomed to dealing with matters of life and death. Each face bore its own expression of shock and dismay. Yet I could not shake the feeling that somewhere among this small group of seemingly respectable individuals lurked a mind capable of transforming a place of healing into a scene of murder. Cupper of Dr. C's body confirmed what the visual evidence had already suggested. There were no obvious signs of violence, no wounds or injuries that might explain his presence in the pool. Yet the careful refastening of the safety grate above him spoke of human intervention rather than accidental death. As Constable Weber supervised the melancholy task of removing the body from the water, Poirot drew me aside with an expression of grim satisfaction. Of Raymond Hastings, we find ourselves presented with the most intriguing puzzle, he murmured. Locked room mystery of the most sophisticated variety, set in circumstances that make investigation both urgent and complex. The full implications of our situation were becoming increasingly clear, cut off from the outside world by the avalanche with no possibility of communication or assistance. We were trapped in this remote mountain eyrie with a murderer who had already demonstrated both cunning and resolve. The pristine Alpine sanctuary had become a prison, and somewhere among its elegant corridors walked a killer who hawkily believed their crime could never be discovered. Chapter 3. Fractured Minds and Hidden Motives. Chapter 3. Fractured Minds and Hidden Motives. The morning following the discovery of Dr. Coe's body dawned crisp and clear, the mountain peaks glittering like crystal in the thin Alpine air. Yet, within the walls of the Clinique Lac Noir, an atmosphere of unease had settled like a persistent fog. The usual routines of the therapeutic establishment had been thrown into disarray, and I observed that the staff moved about their duties with the nervous efficiency of people conscious of being watched. Poirot had established himself in Dr. Coe's private study, a room that reflected its late occupant's passion for order and precision. Medical journals were arranged with mathematical exactness upon the shelves, and the desk, but no trace of clutter, save for a single fountain pen positioned at a perfect right angle to a leather-bound appointment book. "We shall conduct our interviews here," Poirot announced, settling himself behind a mahogany desk with the air of a man prepared for a long campaign. "It is important you understand that we speak with each person in surroundings that may encourage candor. Our first visitor was Major Reginald Thornfield, K., and I confess that my initial impression was one of profound sympathy. The man who entered bore all the hallmarks of distinguished military service. His posture remained erect despite obvious physical discomfort, and his gray eyes held the steady gaze of foam accustomed to command. Yet there was something fragile about him, a quality that suggested glass held together by sheer force of will. "Terrible business, this," the major began, lowering himself carefully into the chair that Poirot indicated. I noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the armrests, and there was a nervous habit of glancing toward the windows, as though expecting some unseen threat to materialize from the snowy landscape beyond. "Indeed," mon ami Poirot replied gently. "You were, I understand, a patient of Dr. Coe." "Patient," The word emerged with unexpected vehemence. The man treated us like laboratory specimens. No understanding of what we've been through, what we've seen. His voice dropped to a murmur. Shell shock, he called it. Malingering. More recently. Poirot's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. Dr. Cole questioned the validity of your condition. Threatened to discharge me, if you must know. Said I was dwelling too much on past horrors. It was time to join the world of the living. Major Thornfield's laugh held no humor. Easy enough to say when you've never heard the screams of dying men, never seen what high explosive does to a human body. I found myself studying the Major's faces he spoke, noting the way his jaw tightened and his pupils dilated slightly at the mention of his wartime experiences. The man was clearly suffering, yet there was something in his manner that suggested depths I could not fully fathom. Your nights here at the clinic, Poirot continued in his most conversational tone. But they are troubled, perhaps, dreams, the Major admitted directly. Sometimes I lose time. Dr. Zimmer assures me it's not uncommon in cases like mine, but it's damned unsettling to wake up in places you don't remember going to. The interview concluded with Poirot's characteristic politeness. Yet, I could see that. He had filed away every gesture, every hesitation, every telling phrase for future consideration. Our next interview proved equally illuminating in its own way. The Dodge accounts, Vladislava Korsov, swept into the room with the bearing of one accustomed to deference. Yet, I detected an underlying nervousness that her aristocratic manner could not entirely conceal. She was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure and dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. This is most irregular, she declared, settling herself with the air of one granting an audience. In my day, such matters were handled with considerably more discretion. Madame Lantès Poirot began with a courtly bow. I'm most grateful for your cooperation. In these difficult circumstances, Dr. Cole was my physician, she continued, as though Poirot had not spoken. A brilliant man, though perhaps too progressive in some of his methods. One appreciates innovation, but there are limits to what civilized people shoulder. I observed Alina hovering near the door throughout this interview, her watchful gaze never leaving her employer. The nurse's protective attitude was evident in every line of her posture, and I noticed how she seemed to anticipate the Countess's needs before they were even expressed. You found Dr. Cole's treatment satisfactory? Inquired the Countess's. Composure flickered for just an instant. Satisfactory is perhaps too strong a word. One endures what one must in the pursuit of help. It was during our third interview that a true complexity of the situation began to emerge. Dr. Margaret Vance entered the study with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to professional challenges. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, I sensed a current of barely suppressed anger. I suppose you'll want to know about my relationship with Emile, she said without preamble, taking the offered chair with a decisive movement. It was hardly a secret that we disagreed on matters of methodology. Dr. Vance was a woman of perhaps 45 years with iron gray hair swept back severely and intelligent eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything they encountered. Her clothing was practical rather than fashionable, and her hands bore the calluses of one accustomed to manual work as well as intellectual pursuits. Disagree, you say? Pooh prompted gently. He stole my research, she replied with a flatness that somehow made the accusation more damning than any emotional outburst could have been. 3 years of work on neural pathway reconstruction, published under his name in the Berlin Medical Journal. When it protested, he suggested that a woman of my limited experience had perhaps misunderstood the collaborative nature of scientific endeavor. The controlled fury in her voice was palpable, and I found myself wondering what depths of resentment such professional betrayal might have engendered. "Yet you accepted his invitation to visit the clinic," Poirot observed. "He came to reclaim what was mine," Dr. Vance replied simply. Emil was planning to sell his research portfolio to a German pharmaceutical concern, intended to present evidence of his plagiarism before that transaction could be completed. As the day progressed, Poirot conducted similar interviews with Dr. Zimmer and the various staff members, each conversation revealing new layers of complexity in the web of relationships that bound together the inhabitants of this isolated sanctuary. I was struck by the methodical nature of Fisk's approach, the way he seemed to gather information about everything from meal schedules to sleeping arrangements, from therapeutic routines to personal habits. "I say, Poirot," I remarked during a brief interval between interviews, "some of your questions seem rather tangential to the matter at hand. What does it matter who takes their morning constitutional when, or which patients suffer from insomnia?" My friend's gray eyes twinkled with that familiar expression of patient to mason. "Mojo Hastings, but it is precisely these details that create the foundation upon which truth may be constructed. Murder, you see, is never merely a single act of violence. It is the culmination of a complex web of relationships, motivations, and opportunities. To understand the crime, one must first understand the community in which it occurred." As evening approached and the staff began their preparations for dinner, I reflected upon the day's revelations. Each person we had interviewed possessed both motive and opportunity for Dr. K's murder, yet none seemed quite capable of the cold calculation required to execute such an elaborate crime. The major's evident instability, the Countess's obvious anxiety, Dr. Vance's professional resentment, all provided compelling reasons for wishing Dr. Core harm. Yet something in their manner suggested that we had not yet glimpsed the true heart of this mountain mystery. The dining room that evening was a study of suppressed tension, each person maintaining the facade of civilized behavior, while clearly aware that they shared their meal with the murderer. As I observed the careful politeness, the stilted conversation, and the darting glances that passed between our fellow guests, I could not help but feel that we're actors in some elaborate theatrical performance, each playing a role while concealing their true nature. The game had indeed begun, but I suspected that the most dangerous moves had yet to be played. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The second day of our enforced isolation dawned gray and forbidding, with fresh snow beginning to fall in a manner that suggested the weather had not yet finished with us. I found Poirot in the hydrotherapy wing at an early hour, examining the pool's elaborate machinery with the concentrated attention of a master clockmaker, studying a particularly intricate timepiece. "Regard Hastings," he said, without looking up. From the control panel he was studying this system. "It is of German manufacture, most sophisticated. To prep it correctly requires not merely casual familiarity, but intimate knowledge of its mechanisms." I peered over his shoulder at the bewildering array of dials, gauges, and switches that governed the pool's temperature, circulation, and chemical balance. The complexity was indeed remarkable, far beyond anything I might have expected in even the most modern therapeutic establishment. "Someone trained in hydrotherapy, you mean?" I suggested. "Persimmon, or perhaps Simeon, who has spent considerable time observing its operation." His gray eyes moved systematically across the controls. "Notice, if you please, the sequence required to activate the safety grate mechanism. Most intricate and certainly not something one could accomplish by chance or desperation." At that moment, Elena appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray laden with fresh towels. I observed her pause almost imperceptibly when she noticed our presence, and there was something in her expression, a flicker of what might have been anxiety, that caught my attention. "Pardon me," she said in her soft, accented voice. "I did not realize the pool area was occupied." Teasley, please do not let this interrupt your duties. Indeed, perhaps you might assist us. You are familiar with this equipment, Nespa. Elena moved forward with that characteristic efficiency I had noted previously, setting down her tray with practiced precision. As she began to explain the various controls, I found myself studying her more closely. She was a woman of perhaps 35 years, with dark hair that she wore in a simple, bund, elegant style beneath her nurse's cap. Her movements were economical and graceful, speaking of professional training. Yet there was something else, a nervous habit of smoothing her starched uniform whenever the conversation turned to technical matters. Dr. Coe insisted that all nursing staff understand the complete operation of the therapeutic equipment. She explained, her hands moving confidently over the controls. He believed that comprehensively lewd was essential for patient safety. "Most commendable," Plume murmured. "And you have worked here long, mademoiselle?" "Nearly 2 years," Elena replied. I noticed a slight hesitation before the answer. With the Countess Winch first sought treatment for her condition. There was something in her tone that suggested depths unexplored, and I made a mental note to discuss this observation with Poirot at the earliest opportunity. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Henrik Zimmer, who appeared with the harried expression of a man struggling to maintain order in circumstances far beyond his experience. He was younger than I had initially supposed it, perhaps no more than 35, with the pale complexion and slightly stooped shoulders of one who spent most of his time indoors studying medical texts. "Mr. Poirot," he began in heavily accented English, "I have been reviewing Dr. Coe's recent patient files as you requested. I must confess, some of his pathologies in the final months have been most concerning." Elena's hands stilled on the towels. She was arranging, and I caught a sharp glance that passed between her and Dr. Zimmer, a look that spoke of shared knowledge and mutual concern. "In what manner concerning?" Poirot inquired mildly. Dr. Zimmer glanced nervously toward Elena, then seemed to reach some internal decision. His treatments had become increasingly aggressive, particularly with patients showing resistance to conventional therapy, which Thornfield, for instance, was being subjected to experimental procedures that I questioned privately. This revelation prompted an immediate private conference with Poirot in Dr. Coe's study, where Dr. Zimmer's account proved both illuminating and disturbing. The young physician painted a picture of his mentor's gradual, transformation from respected practitioner to something approaching a medical tyrant, and presentingly radical treatments upon patients who showed insufficient gratitude for his efforts. Major Thornfield had become quite dependent upon a new form of sedative therapy. Dr. Zimmer explained, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Dr. Coe threatening Nito discontinued the treatment entirely unless the major showed more cooperation with the therapeutic process and the nature of this cooperation. Poirot prompted complete submission to Dr. Coe's authority, absolute trust in his methods, regardless of the patient's own comfort or wishes. Dr. Zimmer's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It was nothing, Mr. Poirot. It was domination. The afternoon brought an unexpected discovery that cast new light upon several of our suspects. While exploring the clinic's library, splendid room lined with medical texts and philosophical works, I chanced upon the Countess in conversation with Elenina. They stood near one of the tall windows, overlooking the frozen lake, their voices low, but their postures tense with obvious distress. The past cannot be changed, Madame Alina was saying in her gentle but firm manner. What happened in St. Petersburg was not your fault. Easy words, the Countess replied bitterly. But Dr. Core did not see it that way. He made it quite clear that my indiscretions would become public knowledge unless I continued to submit to his treatments and pay his exorbitant fees. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. Blackmail here was a motive as old as crime itself, and one that cast the Countess's nervous behavior in an entirely new light. Accidental history was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Margaret Vance, who entered the library with the determined stride of one seeking specific information. Her face bore the expression of barely controlled anger that had become her characteristic demeanor since our arrival. I have been reviewing the publication records, she announced without preamble, addressing Alina rather than myself. Simple theft, meal, deliberately sabotaged my research applications, poisoned my professional relationships, systematically destroyed my reputation in the European medical community. Alina's composure flickered for just an instant, and I caught another of hostile tiny gestures as she smoothed her uniform with trembling fingers. Surely there must have been some recourse, Elena suggested quietly. What recourse exists against a man of Emil's reputation and connections? Dr. Vance's laugh held no humor. He was very clever, very thorough. By the time I understood what he had done, the damage was complete. As evening approached, I found myself alone in Dr. Coe's study, attempting to organize the various notes and observations that Poirot had accumulated during our investigations. The late physician's desk had been left largely undisturbed since our arrival, and I confess that my natural curiosity of me to examine its contents more closely than might have been strict lip proper. It was in the locked bottom drawer, opened with a letter opener and considerable persistence, that I made a discovery that chilled me to the bone. Hidden beneath a stack of medical journals lay a collection of documents that revealed the true depths of Dr. S's deteriorating condition. Personal letters written in an increasingly Eric hand spoke of paranoid delusions and grandiose schemes. Patient files contained inappropriate personal observations and disturbing commentary on their psychological states. Most damning of all, a private diary revealed a mind consumed with suspicion, convinced that his patients, his staff, and his colleagues were conspiring against him. The final entry, dated just 3 days before his death, was particularly chilling. They watch me constantly now, waiting for signs of weakness, but I am stronger than they realize, cleverer than they suspect. The treatments will continue as I see fit, regardless of their protests or their threats. I am the master here, and they shall learn to respect my authority or face the consequences. I sit in the gathering darkness of the Alpine evening, surrounded by the evidence of a brilliant mind's tragic tea. I began to understand that we were dealing with something far more complex than simple murder. Dr. Emile Coe had created his own private kingdom in this mountain fastness, ruling over his patients and staff with the arbitrary power of a desperate dot. In doing so, he had sown the seeds of his own destruction, creating a circle of victims who each possessed compelling reasons to wish him dead. The question that remained was which of them had possessed both the knowledge and the resolution to transform that wish into deadly reality. As the wind whistled around the clinic's modern walls and the snow continued to fall beyond the windows, I could not shake the feeling that we were still only glimpsing the surface of this mountain mystery, and that the most dangerous secrets remained hidden beneath the veneer of civilized respectly. That each of our suspects maintained with such careful determination. Top 10. V. Thin Ice and Thinner Alibis. Chapter 5. Thin Ice and Thinner Alibis. The third morning of our confinement brought with it an atmosphere of barely suppressed tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the clinic. I observed during breakfast that our fellow guest had begun to eye Onina there with the weary suspicion of people who knew that a killer walked among them. Conversations were still today and brief, punctuated by long silences during which one could almost hear the mental machinery of accusation and counter-accusation grinding away behind carefully composed faces. Poirot had summoned each of our suspects for what he termed a more detailed discussion of the evening's events. Andy could see from his methodical preparation that he intended to subject their stories to the most rigorous scrutiny. He had arranged Dr. C's study with characteristic precision, positioning a detailed floor plan of the clinic on the desk alongside a timeline he had constructed from the various accounts already provided. "Well, Hastings," he said, indicating the documents with evident satisfaction. "Now, we shall see how well these stories serve when examined in the harsh light of logic and consistency." Major Thornfield was our first visitor, and I was struck immediately by the change in his demeanor since our initial interview. The military bearing remained, but there was a haunted quality to his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and troubled thoughts. He took the offered chair with the careful movements of a man conscious of his own fragility. Major Poirot began gently. "I should like you to recount for me, if you please, your movements on the evening of Dr. C's death." "I retired early," Thornfield replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Perhaps 9 o'clock. Dr. Zimmer can confirm this. He assisted me with my evening medication." And then the mayor's composure cracked slightly. I dreamed terrible dreams, as always. Thur, you understand? The screams, the explosions." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But this time, the dreams were different. I dreamed of drowning him, holding Coke beneath the water until the life left his eyes. I felt a chill at this confession. But Poirot's expression remained impassive. "Dreams," my friend continued. "They seemed particularly vivid, more real than reality," Thornfield admitted. "When I awoke, my night clothes were damp with perspiration, and I could taste chlorine in my mouth. But I have no memory of leaving my room, no recollection of anything beyond the nightmare itself." Dr. Zimmer, when summoned, to corroborate this account, provided disturbing confirmation of the Major's nocturnal wanderings. "Yeah, it is most common with his condition," the young physician explained nervously. "Several times I have found him in different parts of the clinic during the night. The trauma, it creates a dissociation between sleeping and waking states." "The night in question," Poirot pressed. "I heard him moving about, perhaps midnight," Dr. Zimmer admitted regretfully. "I checked his room at 2 o'clock. He was sleeping peacefully, but his beat appeared to have been disturbed." Our interview with the Countess proved equally revealing, though in ways that cast doubt upon her carefully constructed facade of aristocratic dignity. Cana accompanied her mistresses before, but I noticed that the nurse's protective attitude had intensified, as though she feared watch revelations might emerge. "I spent the evening in prayer," the Countess declared with the firmness of Anya, accustomed to having her word accepted without question. "My private chapel, as my room I have, arranged for my devotions." "Your devotions continued throughout the night, Madame, until nearly dawn," she replied, though I detected a slight hesitation in her voice. It was then that Eleanor's computer finally cracked. "Forgive me, Madame," she said quietly, her eyes fixed firmly on her folded hands. "But I must speak truthfully. You suffered one of your episodes during the night. I found you wandering thicker riders at approximately 1 o'clock, quite distressed and disoriented." The Countess's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Elena, you forget yourself. I cannot remain silent when lives may depend upon the truth." The nurse replied with gentle firmness, "You have no memory of these wanderings, madame. They occur during periods of extreme stress, and you are not fully aware during such times." Dr. Margaret Vance's alibi proved equally problematic when subjected to close examination. She meant that she had spent the evening working in her makeshift laboratory, small room in the clinic's basement that Dr. Core had grudgingly allowed her to use her research. "I was reviewing my notes until perhaps 2 in the morning," she stated, with the confidence of one accustomed to precise schedules. "My work requires absolute concentration, particularly when dealing with complex neural pathway calculations." "Most dedicates," Poirot observed mildly, "and you had adequate lighting for such detailed work." "Certainly, the room is equipped with excellent electric fixtures." It was Constable Weber who inadvertently demolished this alibi when consulted about security procedures. He mentioned his habit of conducting regular patrols around the clinic's perimeter. "I check all the windows each night," he explained in his careful English. On Tuesday evening, the basement laboratory was dark from 11 o'clock onward. No light anywhere in that section of the building. Dr. Vance's response to this contradiction was a flush of anger that she struggled to control. "Perhaps your observation was mistaken," she suggested. "Callie, the windows are small, and the lighting may not have been visible from outside." As the day progressed, Poirot's investigation uncovered additional disturbing revelations about Dr. Carr's recent activities and mental state. A search of his private office yielded a cache of documents that painted a picture of a man whose brilliant mind had become increasingly twisted by paranoia and megalomania. Among the most shocking discoveries was a letter, apparently never sent, addressed to a pharmaceutical concern in Berlin. In it, Dr. Coe outlined his intention to close the clinic permanently and sell his entire research portfolio, including what he described as a revolutionary mechanism for the complete psychological restructuring of traumatized individuals. More troubling still was a collection of patient files that contained observations of a deeply inappropriate nature. Dr. Co had recorded not merely medical symptoms and treatment trespass, but intimate personal details, private conversations, and psychological vulnerabilities that had a bearing on legitimate therapeutic concerns. Monduro murmured as we reviewed these documents in the privacy of his room. The man had become obsessed with power. Not the power to heal, but the power to control and manipulate those under his care. The most damning discovery came in the form of a detailed plan for what Dr. Core termed the final phase of treatment, a series of experimental probes that would, in his words, eliminate all resistance to therapeutic authority through the systematic breaking down of individual will. As evening approached, the atmosphere within the clinic had become almost unbearable. The revelation that their trusted physician had been documenting Nair's most private moments and planning to subject them to increasingly invasive procedures had shattered whatever trust remained among the group. Accusations flew with increasing frequency, and I observed that each person seemed convinced that one of their companions was guilty of murder. It was during this period of mounting tension that Constable Weber made a discovery that appeared to provide the physical evidence that had thus far eluded us. While conducting a methodical search of the clinic's common areas, I found, wedged behind one of the radiators in the main corridor, a small brass key that Dr. Zimmer immediately identified as belonging to the hydrotherapy pool's control panel. This key, Dr. Zimmer explained as we gathered around the evidence, it is required to access the safety systems. Without it, the great mechanism cannot be operated. The key bore clear fingerprints and, more significantly, traces of what appeared taupe, the same specialized lubricant used in the pool's machinery. Here, at last, was tangible proof of the killer's identity. Or so it seemed, until Pooh subjected evidence to his characteristic scrutiny as I watched my friend examine the key with his magnifying glass, noting every scratch and marking with meticulous care. I could not shake the feeling that we're approaching a crucial juncture in our investigation. The alibis had crumbled, the secrets had been exposed, and now physical evidence had emerged that surely must point to our killer. Yet something in Poirot's manner suggested that he viewed this convenient discovery, the deepest suspicion, as though the very obviousness of the evidence was itself grounds for doubt. The game of cat and mouse that had been playing out in the clinic's elegant corridors was approaching its climax, but I suspected that the most surprising revelations were yet to come. Chapter 6. A Soldier's Confession. Chapter 6. A Soldier's Confession. The fourth day of our isolation dawned with an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against the very walls of the clinic. The discovery of the brass key had cast a pall over our small community, and I observed that the usual courtesies of civilized interaction had begun to fry under the mounting strain. Conversations were conducted in whispers, and nervous glances followed each person's movements with the intensity of those who knew that final revelations could no longer be delayed. Major Thornfield had not appeared at breakfast, a circumstance that Dr. Zimmer explained with obvious concern. He has been in his room since yesterday evening, the young physician reported to Pooh during our morning conference, most agitated, refusing all medication and speaking of matters that caused my great worry. What manner of matters? Poirot inquired, with that deceptive vileness that often preceded his most penetrating observations. He speaks constantly of the war, of drowning men, of his responsibility for deaths that occurred years ago. Dr. Zimmer's hands trembled slightly as he consulted his notes, but more disturbing, he has begun to confuse past and present, referring to Dr. Coleosto. He were a German officer who must be stopped at all costs. It was perhaps 10 o'clock when the crisis reached its inevitable culmination. I was in the library, attempting to distract myself with a volume of Alpine geology when the sound of Ray's voice siegeoed through the corridor. Following the disturbance, I discovered a crowd gathered outside Major Thornfield's room, where Constable Webber was attempting to mediate what appeared to be an increasingly volatile situation. The Major himself stood in his doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour, his military bearing rigid, with the kind-off desperate resolve I had witnessed in men pushed beyond their emotional limits. His gray eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and tormented thoughts, and I noticed that his hands shook with a palsy that had nothing to do with his physical condition. "I must speak with Mr. Poirot," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of command, despite its underlying tremor. "There are matters that can no longer remain concealed." Poirot appeared at this moment, summoned, no doubt, by the commotion, and I observed his sharp eyes take in every detail of the scene with characteristic thoroughness of the Major's agitation, the nervous clustering of the other residents, the atmosphere of barely suppressed hysteria that had begun to pervade our mountain prison, all registered in my friend's expression with the clarity of a photograph. "Certain Major," Poirot replied with gentle courtesy. "Perhaps we might retire to Dr. Co's study where we may speak with complete privacy." The procession that made its way through the clinic's corridors had something of the quality of a funeral march. Major Thornfield walked with the measured step of a man approaching his own execution, while the others followed at a respectful distance, their faces bearing expressions of morbid fascination mixed with genuine sympathy. In the study, Poirot arranged the chairs with his customary precision, positioning himself where he could observe both the Major's face and the window that looked out upon the scene of the crime. I took my usual place, his notebook at the ready, though I confessed that something in the Major's manner suggested that this interview would prove different from all that had preceded it. Major Thornfield, Poirot began. You wish to speak with me regarding the death of Dr. Core? I killed him, the Major said simply. The words falling into the silence like stones into still water. God, help me. I murdered Dr. Emile Coe, and I can no longer bear the burden of that knowledge. The confession, when it came, was delivered with a military precision that somehow made it all the more devastating. Major Thornfield recounted in halting but methodical detail his growing regret, Dr. C's treatment, his violent fantasies of revenge, and his fragmented memories of the fatal night. I remember standing at the edge of the pool, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The water was so clear, so inviting, and there was Coe floating face down like a dead fish. But before that, he paused, his hands clenching and unclenching, rhythmically. Before that, I remembered the struggle, his face beneath the water, his eyes wide with terror and recognition. The detail was convincing in its very confusion. Major Thornfield described this military training, which had included instruction in the maintenance of complex mechanical systems, not unlike the pool's safety mechanisms. He spoke of his intimate knowledge of the clinic's layout, gained through months of nocturnal wanderings during his episodes of dissociation. Most damning of all, he produced from his pocket a second brass key, an exact duplicate of the one found by Constable Weber. I took this from Dr. K's office weeks ago, he explained, holding the key with obvious revulsion. I told myself it was merely curiosity, but I knew even then what I was planning. The dreams had become too vivid, too persistent. I could no longer distinguish between sleeping and waking, between memory and desire. The emotional impact of his confession was profound. Dr. Vance, despite her own animosity toward the deceased physician, seemed genuinely moved by the Major's obvious anguish. The Countess dabbed at her eyes with Alice's handkerchief, murmuring words of sympathy in what I took to be Russian. Even Constable Weber, a man not given to displays of sentiment, appeared visibly affected by the broken soldier's admission of guilt. It was Elena's reaction, however, that struck me as most remarkable, other than the relief phone might have expected from learning that the killer had been identified. Sheds played what could only be described as profound grief. Her face had gone pale as parchment, and she gripped the back of her chair with such force that her knuckles showed white against the dark wood. Move, Amy, she whispered, and I could see tears forming in her dark eyes. What terrible burden you have carried alone. The Major's account of the murder itself was both methodical and horrifying. He described his approach to the hydrotherapy wing. During one of his nocturnal episodes, his confrontation with Dr. Core, who had apparently been conducting some sort of late-night inspection of the facilities, and the violent struggle that had ensued. He fought, of course, Thornfield continued, his military training evident in the clinical precision with which he analyzed the physical aspects of the crime. But I had the advantage of surprise, and years of conditioning had made violence natural. To me, when it was over, when I saw him floating there, I knew I had to conceal what I had done. The description of the cover-up was equally convincing. The Major's engineering knowledge, combined with his familiarity with the pool's operation, had enabled him to hostage the scene with remarkable sophistication. It's a careful replacement of the safety grate, the timing required to allow the thin sheet of ice to form the disposal of any evidence that might have connected him to the crime. All demonstrated a level of planning that seemed inconsistent with the actions of a man in the grip of a dissociative eastside. But the dreams continued, he concluded, his voice breaking with emotion. Every night I saw his face beneath the water. Every morning I awoke with a taste of chlorine in my mouth. I could not escape what I had done, could not find peace with the knowledge that I had become everything I once fought against. Constable Weber stepped forward with obvious reluctance, producing a pair of handcuffs with the air of a man performing a distasteful duty. Major Thornfield, I must place you under arrest for the murder of Dr. Emile Coe. The major submitted to the restraints with dignity, his military bearing intact despite the circumstances. I understand, Constable. I have confessed to murder, and I must face the consequences of my actions. As the formal procedures were completed, I found myself studying the faces of our assembled company. The case appeared Tobe closed, the killer identified and confessed. Yet something in the atmosphere suggested that not everyone shared my sense of resolution. Dr. Vance maintained her characteristic air of skeptical intelligence, while the Countess seemed more concerned with Elena's obvious distress than with De Mayor's fate. It was Poirot, however, whose reaction proved most telling throughout the Major's confession. My friend had maintained his customary posture of attentive listening, yet I detected something in his manner that suggested doubt rather than satisfaction. His gray eyes had never left Elena's face during the most crucial moments of the testimony, and I observed him noting her every gesture, every expression, with the intensity of a naturalist studying some rare and fascinating specimen. As the others began to disperse, discussing arrangements for the Major's confinement dental rescue could arrive, Poirot drew me aside with an expression that I had learned to associate with his most profound concerns. "Mon ami," he said quietly, ensuring that could not be overheard. "I fear that we have just witnessed a performance of remarkable courage and selflessness." "What do you mean?" I asked, though something in his tone suggested that I might not wish to hear the answer. "Emon Hastings, that Major Reginald Thornfield has just confessed to a murder he did not commit, and in doing so has demonstrated the kind of honor that makes such men both heroes and tragic figures." The implications of this statement struck me like a physical blow. If Poirot was correct, then we hadn't solved the case, but merely witnessed its greatest complication. A false confession delivered with such sincerity and supported by such compelling evidence that even a trained investigator might be deceived. As I stood in the gathering twilight of the Alpine evening, watching the snow continue to fall beyond the clinic's modern windows, I realized that our mountain mystery had entered its most dangerous phase. Somewhere within these walls walked a killer, clever enough to remain tete-dated while an innocent man shouldered the blame for their crime, and I could not shake the feeling that before this affair reached its conclusion, we would discover depths of deception that would challenge everything we thought we understood about the nature of guilt and innocence. Chapter 7. The Method in the Madness. Chapter 7. The Method in the Madness. The evening following Major Thornfield's dramatic confession found me in a state of considerable unease. While the others seemed content to accept that the mystery had been solved, I could not shake the memory of Poirot's cryptic comment regarding the Major's innocence. My friend had retired to Dr. Coe's study immediately after the arrest, and I had observed him through the glass door, hunched over the desk, with that expression of intense concentration that I had learned to associate with his most complex cases. When I finally joined him near midnight, I found the study transformed into what could only be described as a laboratory of detection. Documents were arranged in precise patterns across every available surface. Photographs of the crime scene were pinned to the walls with mathematical precision, and in the center of it all, Satra, his gray eyes moving systematically from one piece of evidence to another. "Ah, mon ami," he said, without looking up from the timeline he was constructing. "Please, seat." yourself. We have much to discuss, and I fear the truth is far more complex than our gallant Major would have us believe. I settled into the familiar chair, noting the way Poirot had arranged his materials with that obsessive attention to detail that characterized his methods. You truly believe Thornfield is innocent? I do not merely believe it, Hastings. One can demonstrate it. Poirot tapped his fountain pen against a sheet of paper covered with precise notations regarding these technical specifications, the pool's safety mechanism. For the next hour, my friend subjected Major Thornfield's confession to the most rigorous analysis I had ever witnessed. With the methodical precision of a master clockmaker dismantling a timepiece, he identified contradiction after contradiction in the apparently convincing account we had heard. First, consider the tools required for the great mechanism, Poirot began, indicating a detailed diagram of the safety system. The Major claims his military training enabled him to operate this equipment, but observe the specialized nature of these fastenings. They require not merely mechanical knowledge, but specific tools that exist nowhere in this clinic, save in the maintenance workshop, a workshop that remains locked at all times. With the key in Dr. Zimmer's possession, he moved to a second chart. This one documenting the timeline of events on the fatal night. Second, be it the matter of timing, Dr. Zimmer's medical records showed that Major Thornfield experienced his documented episode between 11:30 and 1:15 in the morning. Yet, the positioning of Dr. Coe's body combined with the water temperature readings indicates that death occurred no earlier than 2 a.m. The inconsistencies multiplied as Poirot continued his analysis. The Major's physical condition, compromised by years of trauma and recent medical treatments, would have made the sustained physical effort required for the crime virtually impossible. Moreover, his documented pattern of nocturnal wandering invariably led him toward the clinic's upper floors, ever to the basement-level hydrotherapy facilities. But perhaps most telling of all, Poirot concluded, producing a small vial from his pocket, is this. The vial contained what appeared to be a clear liquid, and I observed Poirot handle it with considerable care. Sodium pentothal. He explained in response to my questioning look. It's a powerful sedative that, when administered in sufficient quantities, renders the subject unconscious while maintaining normal vital signs. I discovered traces of this substance in Dr. C's morning coffee cup, a cup that was meticulously cleaned, but not quite thoroughly enough to remove all evidence. The implications of this discovery were staggering. You mean Dr. Coe was drug beffer? He was murdered. Precisely someone with access to pharmaceutical supplies and the knowledge to administer them safely rendered. Dr. Coe, unconscious, then transported him to the pool and staged his death by drowning. Poirot's eyes glittered with satisfaction. This was no crime of passion committed during a nocturnal episode. This was a carefully planned execution carried out by someone with intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the clinic's operations. As dawn approached, Poirot's investigation took on an increasingly faked character as attention turned from the obvious suspects, those with clear motives and apparent opportunities, to the one person whose very invisibility had made her the perfect candidate for such an elaborate crime. Elena Vasquez, he mused, studying a personnel file that Dr. Zimmer had reluctantly provided. It's her most interesting background, is it not? Trained in Barcelona as a psychiatric nurse with additional certification in hydrotherapy techniques, 5 years experience in institutional settings before her employment with the Countess. I found myself struggling to accept this line of reasoning. But Poirot, she's been nothing but helpful throughout this ordeal, and her devotion to the Countess is evident in every action. But that is precisely what makes her so dangerous, Koo replied. Consider her position in this household. She is trusted implicitly, has access to all areas of the clinic, possesses intimate knowledge of every resident's medical condition and daily routine. She is, as you say, invisible. The perfect servant while moves through our lives without ever attracting suspicion. The evidence against Alina, once Poirot began to assemble, it proved both compelling and deeply disturbing. Her medical training had included extensive work with the precise type of hydrotherapy equipment installed at the clinic. Her access to the Countess's medications provided a ready source of the sedatives to incapacitate Dr. Core. Most significantly, her presence at the clinic predated the Countess's arrival by several months, the fact that it somehow escaped everyone's attention until now. But what possible motive could she have? I protested, still reluctant to accept that the quiet, efficient nurse could be capable of such calculated murder. P.O.'s response came in the form of a collection of documents he had discovered hidden in Alana's private quarters. A search conducted with Constable Weber's reluctant cooperation while the nurse was tending to the Countess's morning routine. The letters, written in Spanish and dating back more than 5 years, painted a picture of a passionate relationship between A.I.D. I just know it's going to be a really good day because I'm going to start out by going to Starbucks, attending to the Countess's morning routine. Elanina and a young medical researcher identified Onias E. The correspondent spoke of shared dreams, collaborative research projects, and plans for a future together that had been shattered by the man's growing obsession with his work and increasing mental instability. Monderai breathed as the truth began told on. Lena and Dr. Cole were lovers, more than lovers, Hastings. They were partners in the truest sense, intellectual equals who shared a visionary, revolutionary psychiatric treatment. Poirot indicated a particular letter with grim satisfaction, but observed the date of this final correspondence. Lena's, of her decision to leave, high, of her inability to watch the man she loved destroy himself through paranoia and megalomania. The picture that emerged was both tragic and terrifying. Elena had returned to the clinic under false pretenses, using her position as the Countess's companion to observe Dr. Coe's continued deterioration. The woman who had once shared his dreams and ambitions had become witness to his transformation into the tyrannical figure we had encountered. A man whose brilliant mind had been twisted by power and isolation into something monstrous. She came back to save him. The coup, continued his voice, heavy with the weight of this revelation. But when she saw what he had become, witnessed the suffering he was inflicting upon his patients, she made a different choice entirely. The final piece of evidence proved to be a journal that Elena had kept throughout her time at the clinic, a document that chronicled her growing horror at Dr. C's methods and her ultimate decision. Faith represented a danger that could no longer be tolerated. The final entry, dated the night before the murder, was particularly chilling. Tomorrow, I will do what love and mercy demand. Emile cannot be allowed to continue this destruction of innocent minds. The man I once loved died long ago. What remains is merely a shadow that causes pain toll who encounter it. I will end his suffering and prevent him from inflicting further harm upon others. ASI sat in the growing light of the Alpine morning, surrounded by the evidence of Elena's elaborate deception. I found myself confronting a truth that challenged everything I thought I understood about the nature of guilt and innocence. Here was a woman who had committed murder, not from hatred or greed, but from a twisted sense of mercy and love. A killer whose motives were as complex as they were ultimately incomprehensible. Poirot gathered the documents with characteristic precision, his expression bearing the weight of a man who had uncovered secrets that perhaps should have remained buried. The case was solved, the true killer identified, but I could see in his manner that this victory brought him no satisfaction. The game was nearly over, but the most dangerous move, the confrontation with a killer who believed herself to be an angel of mercy, still lay ahead of us. As clinic stirred to life around us, and the other residents began their morning routines, I could not shake the feeling that we were approaching a climax that would test not merely our detective skills, but our understanding of thievery, nature, of justice itself. Chapter 8. The Mercy of the Devoted. Chapter 8. The Mercy of the Devoted. The afternoon of the 5th day brought with it a subtle change in the mountain weather. A warming of the air that suggested the iron grip of winter might finally be loosening its hold upon our remote Alpine prison. Yet, within the walls of the clinique Lac Noir, the atmosphere remained as tense and forbidding as ever, weighted down by the knowledge that while one mystery appeared to have been solved, deeper truths remained hidden beneath the surface of appearances. Poirot had requested that all residents gather in the main salon at 4 o'clock, and he observed the reluctant compliance with which this summons was received. Major Thornfield, though officially under arrest, was permitted to attend under Constable Weber's watchful supervision. His military bearing remained intact despite the handcuffs. And there was something in his demeanor that suggested man who had found a peculiar peace in his confession, regardless of its ultimate consequences. The salon itself was a masterpiece of modern design, with its expansive windows offering a panoramic view of the snow-covered peaks that surrounded us. Under normal circumstances, the room would have provided an atmosphere of serene luxury. This afternoon, however, it had been transformed into something approaching a courtroom with chairs arranged in a precise semicircle facing elegant fireplace where Poirot had positioned himself with characteristic theatrical flair. Madame Sure, he began, his gray eyes moving systematically across the assembled faces. We have come together this afternoon to discuss a matter of the gravest importance. The death of Dr. Ramil Co. has cast a shadow over this establishment, and it is time that shadow was lifted through the illumination of truth. Helena sat beside the Countess with her customary quiet composure, her hands folded in her lap and her dark eyes fixed attentively upon his face. Yet, I noticed a subtle tension in her posture that had not been present during our earlier interviews, and her characteristic habit of smoothing her starched uniform had become more pronounced. Major Thornfield, Poirot continued, turning toward the arrested man with evident sympathy. Your confession yesterday was an act of remarkable courage and selflessness. However, I must inform you, and indeed all present, that you are entirely innocent of Dr. C's murder. The effect of this pronouncement was electric. Dr. Vance leaned forward in her chair with sharp attention, while the Countess gasped audibly and pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Most remarkable of all was Eleanor's reaction, barely perceptible tightening around her eyes that spoke of someone bracing herself for inevitably sneeze. The evidence against Major Thornfield, Poirot explained with methodical precision, appears compelling only until subjected to rigorous analysis. The technical knowledge required, the timing of the crime, the physical capabilities necessary, all point away from Argylin Major and toward someone else entirely. For the next quarter hour, my friend systematically demolished the case against Major Thornfield with the thoroughness that had made him famous throughout Europe. He demonstrated the impossibility of the Major's timeline, the inconsistency of his supposed methods, and, most damning of all, the presence of sedatives in Dr. Coe's system that could only have been administered by someone with medical training and pharmaceutical access. No, Poirot concluded this was not a crime of passion committed during a nocturnal Alpine. This was a carefully planned execution carried out by someone who knew both the victim's habits and the clinic's operations with intimate precision. It was then that his attention turned to Elena, and I watched as her composed facade began to crack under the weight his penetrating gaze. "Mademoiselle Elena Vasquez," he said softly. "Or should I say, Dr. Elena Vasquez, for you are indeed a qualified physician, are you not? Despite your current position as a nurse and companion." Elena's response came as barely a whisper. "Yes, and you were, some years ago, the research partner and intimate companion of Dr. Emil Coe when he was conducting his groundbreaking work on trauma therapy in Barcelona." Yes, the confession that followed was delivered with a dignity that somehow made it all the more heartbreaking. Elena recounted her history with Dr. C, their shared passion for healing, their collaborative research into the treatment of psychological trauma, and their plans for a future together dedicated to alleviating human suffering. But Emil began to change. She explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. The recognition, the success, it transformed him from a healer into something else entirely. He became obsessed with power, with control over his patients' minds. When I protested his increasingly aggressive methods, he dismissed me from our partnership and our personal relationship with equal callousness. Poirot nodded with evident sympathy. "So, you returned under the guise of the Countess's companion to observe what he had become. I hoped to find that my fears were unfounded, that the man I had loved still existed beneath the reputation he had built." Elena's composure finally broke, and tears began to flow down her pale cheeks. "Instead, I discovered something far worse than I had imagined. He was systematically destroying the minds he claimed to heal, turning therapy into torture and patients, into victims of his megalomania. The method by which he had carried out the murder was revealed with clinical precision. The carefully administered sedative in Dr. C's evening coffee, tea transport of his unconscious body to the hydrotherapy pool, the staging of the drowning scene, with professional ecstasies that left no trace of violence. Most chilling of all was her manipulation of Major Thornfield's confess. The subtle suggestions planted during his vulnerable moments, the provision of convincing details that only the true killer could have known. "You allowed an innocent man to confess to your crime," Dr. Vance observed with obvious disgust. "I manipulated Heist's existing guilt and confusion." "Yes," Elena admitted without attempting to justify her actions. "But I believed, I hoped, that his military record and dubious mental condition would earn him sympathy and eventual exoneration, and never intended for him to suffer for my decision." The Countess, who had remained silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke in a voice heavy with betrayal and sorrow. "Elena, how could you deceive me so completely? I trusted you with my life, my secrets, my very soul, and I protected you as faithfully as Equed," Madame Elena replied with quiet dignity. "My deception regarding my true purpose here in no way diminished my genuine care for your welfare." As the confession reached its conclusion, Elena's voice took on an almost serene quality that I found deeply disturbing. She spoke of her decision to kill Dr. Call as an act of mercy, not merely for his potential victims, but for the man himself, whose brilliant mind had become his own prison. "I could not bear to watch him continue his descent into madness," she explained, her eyes distant with memory. "The Emil I loved was already dead, destroyed by his own ambition and paranoia. What remained was merely a shell that caused suffering wherever it went. I freed him from that existence, just as he freed his patients from his torment." The sound of engines approaching from the valley below interrupted this melancholy scene. Through the salon's great windows, we could see thief, rescue vehicles making their way up the recently cleared mountain road. Our isolation was finally ending. but the conclusion it brought was far from the relief I had anticipated. Constable Weber performed his duty with obvious reluctance, transferring the handcuffs from Major Thornfield to Elenana, with the apologetic manner of a man forced to arrest someone he had come to respect. She submitted to the restraints with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her confession, offering no resistance and making no further attempted justification. As the rescue party entered the clinic and began the process of evacuating its inhabitants, I found myself standing beside Poirot at one of the great windows, watching the sun set behind the Alpine peaks in a display of natural beauty that seemed almost mockingly peaceful after the human tragedy we had witnessed. "A most complex affair," my friend murmured, his breath fogging the glass as he spoke. "Love twisted into destruction, mercy transformed into murder, healing corrupted into harm. One wonders if true justice is even possible in such circumstances." The convoy that descended from the Clinique Lac Noir that evening carried with it the survivors of a tragedy that would be discussed and denied for years to come. Major Thornfield, vindicated but forever marked by his false confession, rode in silence with the bearing of a man who had glimpsed the true depths of human complexity. Dr. Vance and the Countess sat apart, each lost in private contemplation of how thoroughly they had been deceived by Simone they had trusted implicitly. And in the police vehicle that brought up the rear of our procession, Lena Vasquez rode toward an uncertain fate with the composure of a woman who had acted according to her own moral code, regardless of the consequences. As I watched the clinic disappear behind us into the gathering mountain darkness, I reflected upon the thin line that separates love from obsession, mercy from murder, injustice from revenge, in the rarefied air of the Swiss Alps. We had encountered mysteries that extended far beyond the mere mechanics of crime, touching upon the fundamental questions of human nature and the sometimes terrible choices that love can demand. Thanks for joining us for the affair at Lac Noir. If you enjoyed this mystery with Poirot and the dark secrets of love, mercy, and the thin line between healing and harm, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries like this. Till next time, signing off from Stories Cafe.